Hey guys, welcome back. Okay, so today we're gonna look at a franchise that kinda redefined what an arcade racing game could be. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into every single Burnout game ever. Okay, let's kick it off with the OG Burnout, released in 2001. When Criterion first started cooking this thing up, it was just a prototype internally known as Shiny Red Car. The devs were heavily inspired by these high-stakes car chases in movies like Ronin and The French Connection. They basically realized that the real thrill of a car chase is driving through traffic and other obstacles. So instead of punishing you for driving recklessly, they actively rewarded you for it. Like for example, to fill up on your boost meter, you had to drive on the wrong side of the road, drift around corners, and perform near misses. Earning your boost in this first game was such a rush. It was hard punishing work, but when you finally filled that meter and hit the boost, the rush was unlike anything else on the market at the time. However, looking back on it now, this first game definitely feels like a rough draft or a glorified tech demo. The core idea was there, but the execution was clunky as hell. First of all, the game was brutally unforgiving. You had this classic arcade countdown timer ticking away, and the races were these grueling 8-minute endurance runs across massive tracks, and if you crashed more than 2 or 3 times, your run was completely f***ed. And the cars themselves were entirely unlicensed and incredibly generic, with boring-ass names like Compact, Muscle, and Saloon. Also visually, the game was pretty bland, with a lot of flat textures and an obnoxious overuse of lens flare that would absolutely blind you every time you drove out of any tunnel. But one really cool detail though was the dynamic music system. So every track had a casual, upbeat song that played when you were driving cleanly, but the second you crashed, the music dynamically shifted to a much darker, tragic-sounding track to reflect your failure. It was a neat little touch in a game that, while deeply flawed and visually washed out, planted the seeds for absolute greatness. Okay, moving on. Criterion kinda knew they had something special, and so in 2002 they dropped Burnout 2, a game that took the rough foundation of the original and polished it into an absolute masterpiece. This is where I feel the franchise truly found its identity. The graphics also received a massive overhaul, ditching those bland environments of the first game for gorgeous, vibrant tracks with incredible weather effects like rain and snow. And the vehicles got a major upgrade too, with some wild rides like a 50s hot rod, a gangster car, and even a police car. But I believe the biggest, most game-changing addition to Burnout 2 was the introduction of Crash Mode. Okay, listen, Crash Mode was the reason you bought this game, cause people were spending way too much time watching the slow-mo replays of their crashes in the first game, so they brilliantly turned that into a playable mode. They essentially handed you a car, pointed you at a congested traffic intersection, and told you to cause as much damage as possible. It was beautiful, and it was the ultimate party game mode. And on top of that, it also had Pursuit Mode, where you actually got to drive that police car I mentioned earlier and chase down criminals, ramming them off the road until they surrendered. The core gameplay was also vastly improved with stuff like Burnout Chain, which is if you filled your boost meter and drained it completely, but kept driving dangerously while boosting, the meter would instantly refill, allowing skilled players to chain boosts together for entire laps without ever slowing down. But despite all these amazing additions, the game sadly struggled commercially because the publisher, Acclaim, was going bankrupt and couldn't market it properly. They even pulled a super controversial PR stunt where they offered to pay speeding tickets of anyone caught driving recklessly in the UK on launch day, which naturally pissed off the government but didn't really help with the sales. So anyways, everything changed in 2004 when Acclaim officially went under and EA swooped in, buying Criterion Games and the Burnout IP for $48 million. Now backed by EA's seemingly infinite budget, Criterion delivered what is arguably the greatest arcade racing game ever made, Burnout 3 Takedown. So if Burnout 2 was about dodging traffic, Burnout 3 was about weaponizing your car and obliterating your opponents. And the introduction of the takedown mechanic here fundamentally changed the DNA of the franchise. You were no longer just racing. You were quite literally slamming others into guardrails, oncoming traffic, and concrete pillars. Executing a takedown was the most satisfying feeling in the world. It was a brilliant risk-reward system that turned every single race into a high-speed car fight. Okay, so Burnout 3 also introduced impact time and aftertouch. So in previous games, crashing meant you just put down the controller and waited to respawn. But here, the moment you crashed, you could actually steer your wrecked car through the air. The goal was to steer your car into the path of the one who just took you out, scoring an after-touch takedown. And to highlight this combat focus, they added Road Rage mode, an event with no finish line where the only goal was to destroy a specific number of rival cars before your own vehicle was totaled. And Crash mode was also upgraded with over 100 junctions, adding cash multipliers, heartbreaker penalties, and letting you manually detonate your car once a certain number of vehicles piled up. Anyways, we also have to talk about the presentation of Burnout 3. Cause of EA, the game had some amazing licensed soundtrack full of mid-2000s punk rock and alternative bangers from bands like Yellowcard, Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance, and Franz Ferdinand. It gave the game this high-energy vibe that perfectly matched the chaotic gameplay. Okay, so with the massive success of the console versions, EA inevitably wanted to cash in on the exploding handheld market, which led to the release of Burnout Legends in 2005 for both the PSP and the Nintendo DS. And guys, these two handheld ports were basically two very different games. So like the PSP version, which was developed by Criterion, is an absolute god-tier handheld game. It essentially took the best tracks, cars, and modes from the first three games and perfectly optimized them for the PSP. They somehow managed to cram the entire renderware engine onto a tiny disc with the same sense of speed, the violent takedowns, and the incredible licensed soundtrack. Sure, the graphics were a bit blockier and there was less traffic on the road, but it felt exactly like playing Burnout 3 on the go, which was a massive technical achievement. But the Nintendo DS version, however, is a completely different story. EA outsourced the DS port to a studio called Visual Impact, and it was a really bad game. Also, the DS hardware was incredibly weak, so the game looked like absolute dog shit. The cars were these pixelated boxes, and the sense of speed was completely non-existent. And the crash physics were totally broken, and the traffic density was so low that crash mode was literally unplayable because there were no cars to hit, and the devs mapped the crash breaker and after-touch controls to the touchscreen, forcing you to awkwardly swipe the stylus while trying to steer with the D-pad. It was all very messy, and it's easily the worst game to ever bear the Burnout name, or maybe second worst cause like we have one more later in the video. Moving back to the consoles, Criterion dropped Burnout Revenge in late 2005, and holy shit, if Burnout 3 was about aggressive racing, Revenge went all out. The devs probably thought that simply dodging traffic was for cowards, so they introduced this traffic checking mechanic. So for the first time ever, you could actually rear-end civilian vehicles, and in fact hitting them launched it forward, letting you use them as weapons to hit your rivals. It completely changed how the game felt, but a lot of purists hated this mechanic, cause like it removed the core skill of maneuvering through traffic. And to turn the chaos up even further, they added the crash breaker directly into the racing events. So like if an opponent took you down, you could manually detonate your wrecked car right there on the track, taking them to hell with you and scoring a revenge takedown. Also, the track designs were heavily modified to support this combat-heavy focus with multi-tiered arenas with crazy alternate routes, huge ramps, and terrifying shortcuts. Crash mode was also tweaked, removing the arcadey pickup icons and adding a highly valuable target car to every junction that you had to strategically hunt down. The game also had a very gritty, industrial aesthetic, especially on the Xbox 360, where they drowned everything in motion blur and bloom, making it genuinely hard to see where the hell you were going. But if you ask me, it's a chaotic and a beautiful game that is incredibly nostalgic for anyone who loved the mid-2000s. Okay, so before we move on to the next big title, we gotta look at Burnout Dominator, which released in 2007 for the PS2 and PSP. This game is the bizarre, forgotten middle child of the franchise, and it was actually developed by EA UK instead of Criterion, acting as a stopgap release while Criterion worked on the next-gen hardware. So Dominator is a really strange game cause like it completely removed crash mode, which pissed off a lot of the fanbase who felt it was an essential pillar of the franchise. They also removed the controversial traffic checking from Revenge, bringing back the classic penalty for hitting any civilian vehicle, which I actually prefer. And instead, Dominator focused entirely on driving fast by bringing back the burnout chain mechanic from Burnout 2. So like the entire game revolved around filling your boost meter until it turned blue, hitting the supercharge and then driving as dangerously as possible to refill the meter before it emptied, allowing you to chain boosts together endlessly. They even added a maniac mode where you were graded entirely on your ability to perform these dangerous maneuvers without crashing. And while this chain mechanic was incredibly satisfying and required insane reflexes, the game suffered from atrocious loading times, a painfully slow autosave system, and a slightly downgraded physics engine where the takedowns just didn't feel as meaty as they did in Revenge. Also, the soundtrack featured multiple different language versions of Avril Lavigne's Girlfriend, which is honestly one of the most baffling and hilarious audio decisions I have ever seen in a video game. So anyways, by 2008, the entire gaming industry was like obsessed with open world design, and so Criterion decided it was time for Burnout to evolve. And when they dropped Burnout Paradise, it was a complete ground-up reinvention of everything we knew about the series. Like they completely threw away the traditional menus and the structured tracks, instead dropping you directly into an open world of Paradise City. Like you could just drive around, explore the mountains, the downtown, and whenever you wanted to start an event, you simply pulled up to a traffic light and revved your engine. The game also had a diverse roster of vehicles, and the crash physics were also upgraded for the PS3 and Xbox 360. However, it was incredibly polarizing when it launched. Cause once again, they completely removed the traditional crash mode, replacing it with a bizarre minigame called Showtime, so you could trigger Showtime at any moment, and your car would suddenly turn into an exploding rubber ball, endlessly bouncing down the street and crushing traffic for points. And while it was fun for a few minutes, it got boring pretty fast, at least for me. Furthermore, navigating the open world during a race was an absolute nightmare. It was so easy to take a wrong turn right before the finish line, completely ruining a long race. And at launch, there was no fast travel and no quick restart option. So if you lost, you literally had to drive all the way back across the entire map to the starting intersection, which was a bafflingly stupid design choice that wasted so much of your time. But despite the complaints, Paradise was a success that kinda influenced open-world racers for the next decade, even if the soundtrack weirdly mixed Guns N' Roses with classical music like Mozart and Beethoven while you were idling. Okay, so after Paradise, the franchise basically died a slow, weird death. Criterion was moved off and kind of forced to work on Need for Speed games, making titles like Hot Pursuit and Most Wanted, which actually had some Burnout DNA in it. But anyways, in 2011, EA released one final incredibly bizarre spin-off called Burnout Crash for Xbox Live, PSN, and iOS, and this was a top-down 2D isometric arcade game that played like a goofy pinball machine. You would launch your car into an intersection, blow it up, and use continuous crash breakers to slowly nudge your wreckage around the screen, dealing with random events like pizza trucks, meteor strikes, and UFOs. It was completely cartoonish, it had an annoying announcer, and it had incredibly frustrating gameplay mechanics. It felt like a cheap mobile game, and it served as a really depressing end to the official franchise. And that's the complete chaotic history of the Burnout franchise. It's a series that started as a clunky tech demo, evolved into the absolute undisputed king of arcade racing, and eventually faded away. But man, for that brief window in the 2000s, there was nothing else quite like it.